night was thick with shadows, the kind that clung to the skin and whispered of ancient fears. A cold wind blew from the north, sweeping across the barren plains that stretched out under the vast, indifferent sky. The stars were hidden behind a veil of clouds, and the moon cast only the faintest glimmer of light over the land. In the distance, the jagged silhouette of the Babylonian city of Akkad loomed, its walls a dark line against the horizon. Within those walls, the people of Akkad huddled in their homes, unaware of the danger that crept closer with each passing moment. The giants had been watching them for days, their enormous forms concealed in the mountains that bordered the plains. They were the descendants of ancient titans, towering beings with flesh as hard as stone and eyes that burned with a primal hunger. And now, that hunger had turned towards Akkad. The giants prepare. In the cold embrace of the mountains, the giants gathered. Their leader, Uthrog, was a monstrous figure, standing nearly 5 meters tall, his skin a mottled gray that blended with the stone around him. His eyes were like embers, glowing with a fierce, unyielding light. Around him stood his kin, Svarog, whose arms were as thick as tree trunks, and Yagther, whose breath came in ragged, snarling bursts. They had come together with a singular purpose: to descend upon the human city and take what they desired. Uthrog, rumbled Svarog, his deep voice echoing through the narrow mountain pass. The humans grow fat with wealth. They hoard gold and jewels in their stone houses, thinking themselves safe behind their walls. But we are giants. Walls mean nothing to us. Uthrog nodded, his gaze fixed on the distant lights of Akkad. They have forgotten the old ways, he said, his voice as deep as the earth itself. They grow weak, sheltered by the gods who no longer walk among them. We will remind them of their place in this world. We will take what is ours by right. Yagther let out a low, growling laugh. Their women and children will scream, he said, his voice dripping with malice. Their warriors will fall like leaves in the wind. We will crush them beneath our feet, and their riches will be ours. Uthrog raised a massive hand, silencing his kin. There is no need for cruelty beyond what is necessary, he said, his tone measured. We take what we need: food, gold, and jewels. We leave the rest to rot. But remember this: every life we take, every scream we hear, strengthens our resolve. The humans must know that the giants are not to be defied. The giants fell silent, each contemplating the coming raid. The air around them buzzed with anticipation, thick with the scent of earth and iron. As the first light of dawn began to seep into the sky, Uthrog raised his hand, signaling the advance. The giants moved as one, their massive forms descending from the mountains like an unstoppable force of nature. The attack on Akkad. The sun had barely risen when the ground began to tremble beneath the feet of the citizens of Akkad. At first, they thought it was an earthquake, a common occurrence in these lands. But then, the walls of the city began to shudder, and a deep, resonant boom echoed through the air. Panic spread like wildfire as the people realized what was happening. The giants were coming. Rashid, a captain of the Akkadian Guard, stood atop the city walls, his heart pounding in his chest as he watched the approaching figures. They were enormous, their footsteps sending shockwaves through the ground, their silhouettes dark and menacing against the pale morning sky. To arms, Rashid shouted, his voice carrying across the walls. The giants are upon us. Defend the city. His words spurred the soldiers into action. Archers lined the walls, their arrows nocked and ready, while swordsmen and spearmen took up positions at the gates. The air was thick with tension, the kind that precedes a storm. But despite their readiness, there was a deep, gnawing fear in the hearts of the defenders. They knew in their bones that this would be a fight they could not win. As the giants drew closer, the archers loosed their arrows, a dark cloud of death streaking towards the oncoming horde. But the arrows were as pinpricks against the giants' thick hides. Uthrog batted them away with a sweep of his arm, sending them clattering to the ground like autumn leaves. Is this all they have to offer? Svarog roared, his voice booming across the plains. These tiny sticks? Pathetic. With a mighty crash, Uthrog slammed his fist into the gates of Akkad, splintering the wood and sending shards flying in all directions. The gates buckled under the force of the blow, and with a second strike, they were torn from their hinges, crashing to the ground in a cloud of dust and debris. The giants surged forward, pouring through the broken gates like a flood. Rashid met them head-on, his sword drawn, his men at his side. He slashed at Yakthar's leg, the blade glancing off the giant's skin with a metallic clang. Yakthar looked down at him with a sneer. "Is that the best you can do, little man?" Yakthar growled, raising his foot and bringing it down with crushing force. Rashid barely had time to roll out of the way as the giant's foot slammed into the ground where he had been standing, the impact sending a shockwave through the earth. He scrambled to his feet, his sword trembling in his hand, but he knew it was futile. The giants were too strong, too powerful. All around him, the battle raged. The giants tore through the city like a force of nature, smashing through walls and rooftops, ripping up cobblestones with their bare hands. The soldiers of Akkad fought valiantly, their weapons flashing in the early morning light, but they were no match for the sheer might of the giants. One by one, they fell, their blood staining the ground beneath them. Desperate resistance. In the marketplace, where the finest goods of Akkad were sold, the battle reached a fever pitch. The giants had broken through the city's defenses and now rampaged through the streets, their enormous hands grabbing anything of value: gold, jewels, silks, and spices. The people of Akkad, driven to desperation, fought back with whatever they could find: knives, clubs, even their bare hands. A young woman named Naima stood in the center of the market, her dark eyes wide with terror as she watched the giants approach. Her husband, Hamid, lay dead at her feet, his body crushed by a falling beam. All around her, the sounds of battle filled the air, the clash of steel, the shouts of soldiers, the screams of the dying. "No!" Naima cried, her voice breaking with grief and rage. "You will not take this from us. You will not destroy what we have built." With a cry of defiance, she hurled a stone at the nearest giant, striking him in the forehead. The giant Gormod turned his gaze towards her, his lips curling into a cruel smile. He reached down and grabbed her by the waist, lifting her off the ground as easily as one might lift a child. "You think you can hurt me, little one?" Gormod sneered, his grip tightening around her. "You are nothing but an insect, and I will crush you just as easily." But Naima refused to give in to fear. With all her strength, she drove her knife into Gormod's hand, the blade sinking into his flesh with a wet, sickening sound. The giant roared in pain, dropping her to the ground as he clutched his bleeding hand. "You will pay for that," Gormod snarled, his eyes burning with fury. Before he could strike, a group of soldiers, led by Rashid, charged at him, their weapons raised. They attacked as one, slashing at his legs, his arms, anywhere they could reach. Gormod stumbled back, bellowing in rage as the soldiers swarmed over him like ants. But it was no use. With a single sweep of his arm, Gormod sent the soldiers flying, their bodies crashing into the stalls and walls of the marketplace. Rashid was thrown against a stone pillar, the impact knocking the breath from his lungs. He struggled to rise, but his legs refused to obey him. Naima, too, was on the ground, her knife still clutched in her hand. She looked up at Gormod, who loomed over her like a mountain, his eyes filled with murderous intent. "This is the end, little one," Gormod growled, raising his foot to crush her. But before he could strike, a voice rang out across the marketplace, clear and commanding. "Enough!" Gormod froze, his foot hovering in the air. He turned to see Uthrog, standing at the edge of the market, his massive form silhouetted against the dawn sky. "Enough!" Uthrog repeated, his voice brooking no argument. "We have taken what we came for. There is no need for further bloodshed." Gormod hesitated, his gaze flicking between Naima and Uthrog. For a moment, it seemed as if he might defy his leader, but then he lowered his foot with a grunt of displeasure, the tension in his massive frame slowly ebbing away. Naima lay still on the ground, her heart pounding in her chest as she stared up at the giant who had come so close to ending her life. "Remember Gormag," Uthrog said, his voice a low rumble. "We are here to take what we need, not to indulge in pointless slaughter. The humans are weak, but they are not without spirit. There is no honor in crushing them like insects. Take the riches and the food, and leave them to lick their wounds." Gormag sneered, his lips curling back to reveal sharp, yellow teeth. "As you command, Uthrog," he muttered, though it was clear from the bitterness in his tone that he did not fully agree. Nevertheless, he turned away from Naima and joined the other giants who were already gathering their spoils from the market. The scene in the marketplace was one of utter devastation. Stalls that once overflowed with goods now lay in ruins, their wares scattered across the cobblestones. The air was thick with the stench of blood and smoke, and the cries of the wounded and dying echoed through the streets. But even in the midst of this horror, there was a grim determination in the hearts of the people who still stood, defiant even in the face of overwhelming power. Rashid, struggling to his feet, caught sight of Naima lying amidst the wreckage. Ignoring the pain that lanced through his body, he staggered towards her, his hand outstretched. "Naima," he called, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and grief. "Are you hurt?" Naima turned her head towards him, her eyes glassy with shock. I'm alive," she whispered, her voice trembling. "But Hamid, he's gone. The giants, they killed him." Rashid knelt beside her, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, his heart heavy with the weight of their shared loss. "But we must get you out of here. The giants will not stay long. But until they leave, this city is not safe." Naima nodded numbly, allowing Rashid to help her to her feet. As she looked around at the destruction that had befallen Akkad, a cold fury began to burn within her. These giants had come to their city, taken their wealth, killed their loved ones, and now they would leave, unchallenged, with all they had stolen. It was an injustice she could not bear. "Rashid," she said, her voice hardening with resolve, "we cannot let them get away with this. There must be something we can do to fight back." Rashid shook his head, his expression one of deep sorrow. "We are no match for them, Naima. We are but mortals, and they are beings of ancient power. Our weapons cannot harm them, and our walls cannot keep them out. All we can do is survive this day, and pray that they do not return." Naima clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. "There must be a way," she insisted. "We cannot just let them walk away with everything we hold dear." But even as she spoke, she knew that Rashid was right. The giants were unstoppable, their strength far beyond anything the humans of Akkad could muster. The battle had been lost before it had even begun, and all that remained was the bitter aftermath. The aftermath, as the giants continued their rampage through the city, stripping it of its wealth and leaving only destruction in their wake. The people of Akkad could do little more than watch in helpless despair. The once bustling streets were now littered with the dead and dying, the lifeblood of the city seeping into the cracked and broken cobblestones. In the great hall of Akkad, the leaders of the city gathered, their faces pale and drawn as they listened to the distant sounds of the giants' assault. Among them was Nabu, the high priest, a man of deep faith and wisdom who had served the gods for many years. He stood at the head of the assembly, his hands trembling with the weight of the burden that had been placed upon him. "We cannot fight them," Nabu said, his voice strained with sorrow. "The giants are beyond our power, and the gods have turned their faces from us. We must endure this trial and hope that the balance will be restored in time." A young priest, barely more than a boy, stepped forward, his eyes burning with youthful zeal. "But what of our people, Nabu? What of the lives that have been lost? The wealth that has been stolen? Are we to do nothing?" Nabu closed his eyes, a deep weariness settling over him. "What would you have us do, my son?" he asked softly. "The giants are creatures of the earth, as old as the mountains and as strong as the rivers. We are but men, bound by the limits of our mortality. There is no victory to be found in this battle, only survival." The young priest shook his head, his hands clenching into fists. "There must be a way. The gods cannot have abandoned us. We must find a way to call upon their power, to bring their wrath down upon these monsters." Nabu opened his eyes, gazing at the boy with a mixture of sadness and pity. "The gods have not abandoned us, my son, but neither have they come to our aid. The balance of the world is delicate, and even the gods must respect it. To call upon their power now would be to invite further chaos into our lives. We must endure and trust that the gods will guide us through this darkness." The boy's shoulders slumped, the fire in his eyes dimming as the weight of Nabu's words settled upon him. "I understand, High Priest," he murmured, though his heart was heavy with doubt. "But it is a hard thing to accept, knowing that our people suffer while we do nothing." Nabu reached out and placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, his touch gentle and reassuring. "I know, my son, but sometimes the greatest strength lies in endurance, not in action. We must hold fast to our faith, even in the face of despair." The departure of the giants. By midday, the giants had taken all they could carry. Their massive arms were laden with sacks of gold and jewels, their bellies filled with the food they had plundered from the city stores. Uthrog, standing at the edge of the city, surveyed the devastation with a grim satisfaction. Akkad had been a rich city, but its wealth was now theirs, and the humans had been taught a lesson they would not soon forget. Uthrog called Svarog as he approached, his arms overflowing with the spoils of war. "The city is ours. The humans will not dare to oppose us again." Uthrog nodded, though there was no joy in his expression. "They have been humbled, but they are not broken," he said, his voice heavy with a sense of inevitability. "The humans are resilient. They will rebuild, and in time, they will seek revenge. But that is a problem for another day. Today, we have done what we came to do." Yagther, his mouth twisted into a cruel grin, stomped over to join them. "The little creatures fought hard, but in the end, they were no match for us. It was almost too easy." "Do not underestimate them," Uthrog warned, his gaze hardening as he looked at his fellow giant. "The humans have a strength that is not measured by size or power. They are weak, yes, but they are also cunning. We would do well to remember that." Svarog shrugged, his massive shoulders rolling like boulders down a hill. "Let them plot and scheme," he said dismissively. "We will crush them again, just as we did today." Uthrog said nothing, his thoughts turned inward. He knew that today's victory was only temporary, a momentary advantage in a conflict that would continue long after he and his kin were gone. The humans would not forget this day, and neither would he. "Enough talk," Uthrog finally said, his voice a low growl. "We have taken what we need. It is time to return to the mountains. Let the humans bury their dead and nurse their wounds. We will see what comes of it." The giants began their retreat, their footsteps heavy and deliberate as they made their way out of Akkad, leaving behind a city in ruins. The people watched them go, their hearts filled with a mixture of relief and bitter anger. They had survived the attack, but the cost had been high, and the scars left by the giants would take generations to heal. The morning of Akkad, as the sun dipped towards the horizon, casting long shadows over the desolate streets, the people of Akkad emerged from their hiding places. The air was thick with the acrid scent of smoke, and the wails of the bereaved filled the air, rising up to the heavens like a mournful chorus. They gathered their dead, carrying the lifeless bodies of loved ones to the central square, where a great pyre was being built. Naima, her face streaked with dirt and tears, stood beside Rashid as they watched the flames consume the bodies of the fallen. The heat from the fire washed over them, but it did little to warm the cold that had settled in their hearts. "They will come again," Naima whispered, her voice hollow. "The giants will return, and when they do, what will we have left to fight them with?" Rashid's jaw tightened as he stared into the flames. "We will rebuild," he said, though the words felt empty even to him. "We will gather our strength, and we will find a way to defend ourselves. We must." Naima shook her head, her eyes distant. "The giants are too powerful. We are but ants beneath their feet. How can we hope to stand against them?" Rashid placed a hand on her shoulder, his grip firm. "We are more than ants, Naima. We are human. We have survived for centuries in this harsh world, and we will survive this. The gods may seem distant, but they have not forsaken us. We must hold on to that hope. Naima looked up at him, searching his face for the truth behind his words. She wanted to believe him, to find comfort in his strength. But all she could see was the darkness that loomed on the horizon, the shadow of the giants that would forever haunt their city. Hope, she repeated softly, the word tasting like ash on her tongue. I will try, Rashid, but it is hard to hope when all you see is despair. Rashid nodded, understanding her pain all too well. We must find hope in each other, Naima. That is how we will survive. Together, as the flames climbed higher into the night sky, the people of Akkad stood united in their grief, but also in their determination to survive. They had faced the wrath of the giants and had been left battered and broken, but they were not yet defeated. The fires of their spirits still burned, and as long as there was life, there was hope. But even as they gathered to mourn their dead, the shadows of the giants loomed large over Akkad, a reminder of the brutal power that had nearly destroyed them. The battle was over, but the war had only just begun.